So thank you everyone for joining us. My name is Brene Lloyd and I'm with Northwatch. We are part of We the Nuclear Free North, and we're very pleased to have with us this evening Dr. Gordon Edwards, President of the Canadian Coalition for Nuclear Responsibility. And this evening's session is to talk about radiation. What is it? How does it work? We last week had a session with Mary Olson and Cindy Fockers on radiation and health. Dr. Edwards is going to talk about the mechanics of radiation, and there will be some overlap with those radiation and health concerns. And before we get underway, before we move on to Dr. Edwards, I just want to give a quick overview of where we're at right now with the Nuclear Waste Management Organization's project. And their project is to select a site, and to that site, they will transport, then they will process, bury, and abandon all of Canada's high-level waste in that single location. And they're studying two sites. One site is the Revel site, which is at the headwaters of the Wabigoon River. It's 20 kilometers upstream from Wabigoon, the Lake Ojibwe Nation, and 25 kilometers upstream from Denmark. And that's the site we're going to be talking about this evening. This session is in particular, everyone is welcome, but it's in particular for residents who live in the area of the Revel site and downstream from that site. So I think we've been in this conversation for a number of years now, but there are always new people joining the conversation. So just to recap, why nuclear waste is a problem. It's a problem because it's toxic, it's radioactive, and it can harm us. It can harm wildlife and the environment, and it will remain harmful for hundreds of thousands of years. We now have a large stockpile in southern Ontario, smaller volumes in New Brunswick and Quebec, from the production of electricity using nuclear power reactors. And that stockpile, 60,000 tons to date, are the waste that the NWMO is seeking a location for. And they're studying a location in the heart of Treaty 3 territory between Ignace and Dryden. The industry, the Nuclear Waste Management Organization, will refer to that as the Ignace site. The site is the Revel site between Ignace and Dryden. Ignace's involvement is that they put their hand up in 2010 saying they'd like to learn more about this national infrastructure project with a very large price tag attached to it. So we do have a large volume of high-level radioactive waste that has been created. It does need to be stored safely into perpetuity, managed safely, contained and separate from the environment into perpetuity. So what's needed for safe storage? The waste and waste containers would be stored in a system where they can be carefully monitored for failures and for radioactive releases. The failed containers can be repaired, they can be replaced. The waste is stored close to where it was created to avoid the risks of transportation and the releases of radioactivity along the transportation route. Any packaging or transferring of the waste from one container to another happens before the waste is moved. It happens at the reactor station, even if it's being moved a short distance. That transfer and repackaging happens at the point of generation. And the host community of any new facility can say no until a review of the final operating license has been completed. So in contrast to that, what is the NWMO's plan? What's the NWMO proposing? Under their system, the monitoring of the container will end when the underground rooms are sealed. The individual containers will not be monitored after that, and when they fail, there will be no warning notice. So as a result of that, nothing will or can be done to repair or replace the containers after they're buried. Radioactive releases will eventually make their way into the environment. The Revel site is 1,700 kilometers from the nuclear stations in southern Ontario, farther from New Brunswick and Quebec. And that's going to mean 2 to 3 trucks per day for 50 years plus, and there will be releases of radiation and potential for radioactive exposures, which are much larger, could be much larger if there was an accident that resulted in a failed or breached container. The waste will be moved into burial containers at the rebel site in a technically challenging process that's expected to contaminate the site and the workers and generate new radioactive waste. So contrast that to what a safe and sound plan would be, where the waste are transferred into containers right at the reactor station, where the facilities are there to do that. In Sweden, the host community had veto over the project until the final licensing stage. The NWMO likes to talk about Sweden as an example of a deep geological repository, but they are selective in what parts of that example they want to follow. For example, that host community also had the reactor station in the community, had a veto until the very final licensing stage. In contrast, Ignate and South Bruce have agreed to support the project through all the review stages, even after major project changes, and future councils cannot say no. Very different from the approach taken by Sweden. So that's just a very brief recap to set the stage for our evening with Dr. Edwards. And so with that, I'm going to turn it over to Dr. Gordon Edwards, who I think is known to many. He's the president of the Canadian Coalition for Nuclear Responsibility and has been a great resource to the public and to nonprofit, non-governmental community organizations for literally decades now. So thank you again so much for joining us, Dr. Edwards, and I'll turn it over to you now. And we will come to a question and answer period after Dr. Edwards' presentation.
Well, hi, everybody, and thank you very much for the invitation to participate in this. I'm going to try and retrace the steps by which I myself became aware of the problems of nuclear by sharing my slideshow. Is that visible now?
Yes, that's great. Thank you.
Okay. So nuclear fuel waste, an overview from my own personal perspective. I was born in 1940, and when I was 3 years old, the heads of government of Canada, the United States, and Britain met in Quebec City and agreed to cooperate in building the world's first atomic bombs. This was in the middle of World War II. And the reason why Canada was involved was because Canada had stockpiles of uranium that was readily available. Without uranium, it's the key element in all nuclear fission technology. Without uranium, there would be no nuclear bombs of any description whatsoever and no nuclear reactors either. So uranium is pretty important. Of course, that uranium was mostly on indigenous land, particularly up in the Great Bear Lake region, just 100 kilometers or so south of the Arctic Circle, where the Satu Deni people had lived for thousands of years. And there was a deposit of radioactive ore, which was initially used for radium production. And when it was discovered that uranium could be used for bombs, it was converted to uranium production. Now, the power of uranium is amazing. This is the effect of one bomb dropped on one city once from an airplane, exploding in the air considerably high above the city and doing this enormous destruction. So inside the uranium atom, there's incredible forces locked up. In fact, strangely enough, one of the smallest objects in the universe, the nucleus of an atom, contains the strongest force in the entire universe that we know of. Now, way back in 1896, a man named Henri Becquerel had the first indication of the hidden energy in uranium atoms. He discovered radioactivity of uranium and thorium ores. And what is radioactivity? Well, it turns out that these atoms, unlike most atoms, are unstable. And being unstable, they're like little time bombs. They explode. And when they explode, it's called a disintegration. It's a very, very submicroscopic explosion. You can't hear it, you can't feel it, you can't experience it in any direct way, but it gives off a kind of subatomic shrapnel, which is called atomic radiation, which is not the same as most of the radiation we talk about in daily life. You know, radio waves, TV waves, even X-rays. These are all things that can be turned on and turned off. Radioactivity cannot be turned off. It's something that we don't know how to control. It simply is a disintegrating atom. It gives off these damaging particles, and they damage living cells in such a way that they can grow abnormally. And in that way, they can turn into cancer cells or they can turn into other abnormalities. Now, you can't see radioactivity, but if you put a lump of uranium ore in something called a cloud chamber, you can see the tracks of the radioactive particles that are being given off all the time. Now, this is amazing because this rock, which just looks like an ordinary rock, is giving off this energy 7 days a week, and it's been going on for millions of years. It has without any diminution. It's just this energy is pouring off this rock. And they did some mathematical calculations early on, and they found that if you added up all the energy given off, if you added up for a few thousand years, you came to an astonishing figure that would be enough to basically destroy the Earth. However, there was no way that anybody knew of speeding up or slowing down or stopping radioactivity, so there was no trigger to get that happening. Now, Marie Curie, just a couple of years later, discovered that when she crushed the uranium ore and extracted the uranium chemically, she found that the uranium was indeed radioactive, but the waste rock was even more radioactive, about 6 times more radioactive. And she reasoned that there were other elements there, and she discovered 2 of them, radium and polonium. We now know that these other elements are actually what are called decay products of uranium. When uranium disintegrates, it actually changes into a new element. And every atom of radium started off as an element of uranium. Now, these girls who are just young teenagers, they're even preteens, many of them, back around the 1920s, it was discovered that they were suffering a host of deadly illnesses as a result of very, very tiny amounts of radium. When they licked the tips of their brushes to get a very fine point they were using radium paint to make dials glow in the dark. And they ended up dying from fatal anemia, which also killed Marie Curie and her daughter Irene, and an epidemic of bone cancer, which is a very rare disease, which obviously came from the radium that they were being exposed to. And later on, head cancers. The head cancers were due to the fact that when the radium atoms, which go to the bones, like calcium, they go to the bones, the radium atoms, and when they disintegrate, they turn into radon gas, and that's carried by the blood up to the head. And that's where the head cancers came from. So we learned very early on that radioactivity is nothing to fool around with. In fact, Marie Curie used radium to kill cancer tumors because she knew it was very destructive to living cells, especially fast-growing cells. So using it to kill tumors was not a bad idea. Now, it was also found by the 1930s that, in fact, radon had been killing underground miners for centuries. Thousands and thousands of underground miners have been dying by breathing this radioactive gas, which is odorless, tasteless, and undetectable except with very precise instruments. Now, everything changed around 1938, 1939, around Christmas time of 1938. In Berlin, it was suddenly discovered that there was a trigger that would release a lot of nuclear energy all at once, and that was called the neutron. When a neutron strikes a particular kind of uranium called uranium-235, it will actually split into 2 other smaller atoms. These are called fission products. And it will also give off a lot of energy. A great deal of that nuclear energy is released at this moment, but there's also more neutrons given off. And those more neutrons allow you to multiply the energy. And it's that multiplication of energy, splitting trillions of more atoms, that give the atomic bomb, and which also gives the force of a nuclear reactor. Meanwhile, the smaller atoms that are produced, the fission products, are highly radioactive elements, most of which were never found in nature before 1939. And that's the bulk of the radioactive waste from nuclear reactors. Now, here in Canada, we didn't build our own bombs, although we did sell material for the American to build bombs for 20 years after the Second World War. A CANDU fuel bundle can be handled relatively safely before it's used. It's full of little pellets. You see the man holding a pellet there. It's really a simulated pellet. It's only made of uranium ceramic, and those are inside the tubes for those fuel bundles. And that's to get the chain reaction going inside a nuclear reactor to boil water to generate electricity from the steam. Now, this is what a CANDU fuel bundle looks like. And the amazing thing is that you can handle it pretty safely before it goes into the reactor. But after it comes out, it is millions of times more radioactive than when it went in, and it's deadly. It will kill any human being within a meter of it, within a matter of seconds, as a matter of fact, the moment it comes out. And even after 30 years of cooling off, it still cannot be handled safely with human hands. It has to be handled robotically. A fuel bundle looks solid, but radioactive materials are inside the fuel bundle, and those radioactive materials leak out through tiny pinholes and cracks. Severe fuel damage causes massive leaks, and fuel itself suffers corrosion, distortion, and embrittlement in the reactor. One thing I'd like you to bear in mind is that the fuel bundle that we see here is not really the radioactive waste, but the container of the radioactive waste. And the radioactive wastes are plural. There's hundreds of them, all different materials, which are like evil twins of non-radioactive materials we find in nature. A Candor nuclear reactor works, the fuel itself is in the yellow area there called the reactor core, and that's where the fission products are created. All the radioactivity, artificial radioactivity, is created inside the reactor core, but the water passes through the core and goes up to the boiler, which is called the steam generator. That's where the steam is produced, and that's what turns the turbine to generate electricity later on. That primary cooling system, the one that goes up to the boiler and back to the reactor core, that spreads the radioactivity throughout the nuclear reactor, small amounts, but nevertheless significant. For example, here's one of those boilers, one of those steam generators that has been removed from the Bruce reactors. It weighs about 100 tons. It's on a 40-wheel truck. It has to be stored as radioactive waste because there are contaminated materials inside the steam generator from leaking fuel bundles. 8 materials with a half-life of over 1 million years, 13 with a half-life of over 100,000 years, 19 with a half-life of over 1,000 years, and 21 with a half-life of over 100 years. Now, what do I mean by half-life? Half-life is just the time it takes for half of the atoms to disintegrate. Half. So if you wait, for example, for 30 years with cesium-137, that's the half-life. There'll only be half as much cesium-137 when 30 years go by. Wait another 30 years, there's only a quarter as much left. Now, the radioactivity is so intense from these fission products that if you don't remove the heat, even after the reactor is completely shut down, the heat generated by the radioactivity is enough to melt the core of the reactor. That's what happened at Fukushima, in fact. The reactors were safely shut down after the earthquake in 2011. And it was only hours and days afterwards that the actual cores of those 3 reactors actually melted down. And that was simply because of the radioactivity, which could not be turned off, and which, because the pumps, they lost the electricity, they couldn't remove the heat, and that's what caused the meltdown. They have to put CANDU fuel in a deep pool of water circulating for about 10 years to prevent it from overheating spontaneously. After they take it out of the pool, they put it into a dry storage cask. And I would like to emphasize here that I prefer to talk about radioactivity and not radiation, because radioactivity is these are actual materials which themselves are giving off subatomic radiation. But radiation is mostly in the form of particles. It's not just in the form of energy. But this particular waste storage container weighs 60 tons when it's empty and 70 tons when it's full. So the container itself weighs 6 times more than the contents of the container, which is the spent fuel. And that's because it's so radioactive. You notice at the very top, there's a little safeguard seal. That's to ensure that nobody is able to open up that cask and take away the plutonium. The plutonium inside is one of the materials that's produced as a byproduct, and it happens to be a powerful nuclear explosive, which is used in most of the nuclear arsenals of the world. So there's 40 kilograms of plutonium, enough for about 6 to 7 atomic bombs inside each one of these dry storage containers. Now, they have to take what they plan to do in order to get the material away from the reactor, which is not particularly a good idea. They have to take the fuel out of the dry storage containers and put them in what's called a transport container. And the transport container, this has to be trucked over roads up to wherever it's going. There's 192 bundles per container. And as was pointed out by Brenane Lloyd, 635 shipments per year for 30 to 60 years. This is a lot of transportation of very radioactive material. When it arrives at its destination, they have to use what are called hot cells in order to repackage the waste once again, to take these fuel bundles out of the transport containers and put them into smaller containers, which are effectively burial containers. And as pointed out by Brenane Lloyd at the beginning, it would be much more sensible not to move this fuel so often, because every time you move the fuel, there's a danger of damaging it. In fact, it already may be damaged. Little pinholes, little cracks are enough to allow radioactive materials to escape. And I'll show you more about this in a moment. These are the burial containers. Their thickness of copper coating is only 3 millimeters. In Sweden and Finland, they're planning to use 50 millimeters of copper. But there are 48 used fuel bundles in each copper seal container, and they want to put these down underneath. The problem is, how do you do all this handling without increasing the leakage? Already these materials have been leaking out of the fuel bundles. Even in the spent fuel bay, they were leaking out. The water in the spent fuel bay has filters to filter out the material that leaks out. And those filters end up being radioactive waste, very intensely radioactive waste material. Here's a man from Canadian Nuclear Association, an ad called Small Wonder. He's saying, this little pellet, isn't it wonderful how much energy we can get out of it? But you notice that pellet is sort of what they talk about. The NWMO talks about these pellets. They're in the fuel bundles, but they look so nice right there. But if you actually look at an actual pellet, once it comes out of the reactor, it's all cracked because of the enormous temperatures and pressures and the violence that's done to it inside the nuclear reactor. It's cracked many, many times over. And there's a gap between the fuel pellet and the coating outside, which is called the cladding. And a lot of the radioactive gases and vapors are collecting in that gap. In fact, about 2.2% of the cesium and iodine radioactive forms of cesium and iodine are in that gap, which means that any damage to the outer cladding will immediately release radioactive materials from the fuel. And that damage does not have to be very great, as you can imagine. Now, there's also, you notice the grains inside the damaged fuel. Here's another picture which shows you how there's little lodgings of fuel grains. They have fission gas bubbles inside. This is radioactive gases. And there's also on the boundaries of the grains, there's radioactive material, which includes radioactive carbon with a half-life of 5,700 years, radioactive iodine with a half-life of 16 million years, radioactive cesium with 2 half-lives, because there's 2 varieties, 30 years and 3.5 million years. And there's radioactive technetium, 210,000 years. These are materials which are in the gap. They're in the gap. They're ready to be released right away, as soon as there's any damage to the fuel as you handle it. Also, towards the outer perimeter of the fuel pellet, there is plutonium. The rim is enriched in plutonium. So the plutonium is much closer to the edge and therefore easier to be released if there's any further pulverization or damage. Now, when these materials get out of the fuel, they then enter into the food chain, and they enter into the water systems, into the natural systems of nature, and they go everywhere. And these are radioactive materials. Each one has its own particular pathway through the environment and through the human body. And in 1978, there was a Royal Commission of Inquiry down in Toronto called the Royal Commission on Electric Power Planning. And they issued an ultimatum. They said, you've got to solve the waste problem. They said, hopefully by 1985, or else you have to consider stopping nuclear growth. Don't build any more reactors unless you can solve this problem. Now, the reason why they were so adamant about this is because nobody knew that there was radioactive waste for the first 30 years. The nuclear industry simply did not tell the decision makers or the public that this was an unsolved problem of the human race. So radioactivity is a form of nuclear energy that cannot be shut off, The nuclear energy that goes into the bomb goes into boiling water in a nuclear reactor, but that's not where all the energy goes. A lot of the energy goes into all those radioactive waste byproducts, which continue to give radioactive nuclear energy for millions of years to come. That's why we have a nuclear waste problem. Now, when these radionuclides, which are chemical substances that are also radioactive with those unstable atoms, they go to different parts of the body depending on the chemistry. For example, iodine 131 or iodine 129 either goes to the thyroid gland in the throat and causes damage to the thyroid. In Belarus, for example, next to Ukraine, 6,000 children had to have their thyroid gland surgically removed because of iodine contamination from the Chernobyl accident in 1986. Another element is cesium-137, and there's also cesium-135. Cesium-135 has a 3 million year half-life. Cesium-137 has a 30-year half-life. Cesium goes to the soft tissues, the meat, and that's what makes meat unsuitable for marketing. For example, the sheep farmers in northern England and Wales could not sell their sheep meat for 20 years after the Chernobyl accident because of cesium contamination of the grass, which led to cesium contamination of the sheep meat. Strontium-90 behaves like calcium. It goes to the bones, the teeth, and mother's milk. My point here is that there are hundreds of these radioactive materials, and they all have their own specific behavior. They all target different organs, and they go and follow different pathways through the environment. Now, the targets of low-level radiation exposures are populations. The larger the population dose, the greater the damage. The targets, for example, radioactive materials enter into the air, the water, and the soil. They get into fish, plants, animals, and humans. A small fraction of the population will develop cancer as a result of this. Years later, infants and children are especially vulnerable, and it turns out that women are about twice as vulnerable as men to this kind of damage from environmental radioactivity. If larger population is exposed to the same level of contamination, we say that the population dose is greater, and in that case, you get more incidences of cancer. So without any further contamination of the environment, the larger the population is exposed, the more cases of cancer and other adverse health effects you will see. And that's why it's very important, because this larger population could not just be only the present population, but future populations as well. These girls, this is a photograph taken by my friend Robert Del Tredici, who took some of the other photos. These girls are learning for the first time that radioactive reprocessing liquid waste was dumped into the Techa River, which runs by their village, and is the main reason for the deaths and illnesses, which the doctors were forbidden to use the word radioactivity. They were told to use the word vegetative syndrome. That people were getting sick and dying from vegetative syndrome, but in fact, it was radioactivity. Here's a man, Barney Hannibal Paulson. He came to me here in Montreal, and he had been a corporal in the RCAF, and he'd been ordered to go to Chalk River to help clean up after a nuclear accident in 1957. And several years later, he started developing cancers all over his body. He had over 200 operations for cancers in every part of his body. And we had to go to court 8 times in order to get him a pension, because in fact, the nuclear authorities did not want to acknowledge that that this health damage was caused by radioactivity, which it quite evidently was. So I just want to say a concluding word about an alternative to abandoning the waste. The Canadian Coalition for Nuclear Responsibility proposes a nuclear waste policy based on honesty and frankness. We begin by admitting that abandonment is not acceptable, and the alternative to abandonment is what we call rolling stewardship. It's not a solution, but it is an ethical waste management policy. It's needed until a genuine solution is found, because abandonment really results in amnesia. It means that there's no transparency, no education, no consultation, no alternatives, no remediation. After the stuff is buried and abandoned, there's nobody home. And in fact, this is what the industry wants to do, because then they can say it's not our problem anymore. Whatever problem it is, it's not ours. It's going to be your problem now. So we don't think this is the right thing to do, particularly with all the uncertainties. We've already had 3 underground repositories that have failed, 2 in Germany and 1 down in Carlsbad, New Mexico. These are not even high-level waste repositories, but repositories for much lesser radioactive materials. We don't want to have amnesia. We want future generations to know about the radioactive legacy we are leaving them so that they know how to deal with it. Rolling stewardship begins by recognizing we have no proven solution. It says we have to have monitored and retrievable waste for the foreseeable future. It has to be packaged safely for extended periods and repackaged later. And intergenerational containment has to be continually improving so that the next generation might be able to do better than we are doing. It's not a solution, but it's an ethical approach until a genuine solution is found. In the meantime, the production of additional waste can and should be phased out. You remember that in 1978, the Royal Commission on Electric Power Planning said that there shouldn't be any new nuclear reactors until they solve this problem. Well, that's what we should do. We should not keep producing this waste. As long as we're producing new waste at the surface, even if you bury all the old waste, and even if it was safe to do so, that would not be a solution because we'd be still having all the waste that's being generated at the surface. And in fact, 30 years worth at each reactor site because you can't move it until it's 30 years old. So we're not solving the problem at all. We're just giving the industry a license to produce more and more waste. Rolling stewardship, it depends upon the persistence of memory. It depends upon passing the information along and the resources to the future generation so that it's an intergenerational management strategy, and those in charge ultimately have to be independent of the nuclear industry. It doesn't mean we don't use the nuclear industry expertise, but they should not be the ones calling the shots. They should not be the ones making the decision. They should not be the ones deciding what people should be told about this radioactive waste, because all they tell people about it is that it's safe, 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 safe. And there's no problem, no problem, no problem. Well, that is not communication, that's propaganda. Thank you very much.